There we go. Open again with a prayer. I decided this week I would open with a prayer called "In the Evening." Since we're talking about history, it seemed thematically to fit. O Lord, support us all the day long until the shadows lengthen and the evening comes, and the busy world is hushed, and the fever of life is over, and our work is done. Then in thy mercy, grant us a safe lodging and a holy rest, and peace at the last. Amen. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen with you all, and we shall take it from there. And if all is well, I'm going to put that up there out of my way. Oh, Adrian, you could use that chair, Adrian. You don't need one all your own.
Well, what if somebody else?
Okay, fine, thank you.
She wants her own special chair.
She wants her own special chair. All right. Hopefully, I'm gonna walk out here just to change the look of things a little bit. Talking with you and with the screen as well. I see David Depew is joining us also. Church 101, again, everything you always wanted to know. I've walked off screen there. There, that catches more of it. Everything you always wanted to know, but didn't know who or how to ask. So we've talked about, let's see, baptism and creeds and the Bible and prayer and worship so far. Anything that I forgot to cover in those topics, broad as they are and as briefly as they were each touched upon that. Ken, do you have any questions now?
No, but I've got one formulated.
Okay, keep working on that. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, well, and David has fallen off our screen, I believe. This is our outline. Look, I can do this. They can't see the laser at home. This is what we've done so far. And today is the first of 2 parts on church history. And I can assure you that 2 parts on church history aren't nearly enough. So that's just the way it is. It's Church 101. It's not graduate level stuff.
Jed, I'd just like to comment that I believe if more people knew more about church history, it would help them in their theological struggles.
Is there anything in particular that occurs to you that might be illustrative?
Well, it shows that there's been diverse understandings all along, and it hasn't all been cut and dry like so many people think.
That is a very good point, which I don't think my introductory remarks will get to, but that's an excellent point.
And David is now here.
And David,
I'm trying to get in the door.
Oh.
welcome, David in the flesh.
Yeah.
All right, church history. Let's jump into it. This is extra credit. 2,000 years is a lot to cover. Ed Friedlander, I haven't heard from in over 20 years. I have probably over 25 years. I have no idea what he's up to these days. He was a pathologist in Kansas City. I knew him because his parents were members of the church I served when I was in Illinois. And Ed Friedlander was, I hope and pray still is, idiosyncratic and brilliant. And he worked up these history lessons on that website. And if you were to Google Ed Friedlander Anglican Timeline, you too could find this for yourself. And you could read about church history for a long time. I did check, the website's still there. But I'm not going to get into all of those details. Instead, I'm going to just give a slice of history here. I'm going to start with this story. This is a picture that was taken. I think I did take it myself in spite of the angle. I think I used my timer to do it. This is in Wales, in England. And that's a younger me with a younger Bart. That was in 2012, I believe, we were visiting. And I just use that as a backdrop to tell the story of the cathedral and the well by Frederica Harris Thompson in her book, We Are Theologians, which I don't think I fully credit there. But Frederica's story is one she says her parents told her as a child, and she uses it for somewhat different reasons, but I use it to talk about history. In her story, she talks about how pilgrims were crossing a desert, a vast, dry, arid desert that was dangerous to cross. Except if you knew it, there was a well in the center of the desert in just the right place that would allow you to get there and then to continue your journey the rest of the way if you stopped at the well. And over time, people who had found the well decided it was so life-giving that they should mark the location of the well. And they marked it with rocks, with cairns, with something like that. And over time, they kept adding rocks and other things to it until they built this amazing, beautiful cathedral. And then what happened over time is people would make their pilgrimage across the desert, and they would see this cathedral, but they were thirsty. So without knowing that they should stop in the cathedral for the life-giving waters, they would keep going and perish. Until one day, one of those pilgrims gets to the cathedral and places a rock that had been misplaced, places a rock there, and hears the sound of water and discovers there's water beneath that well, and so is sustained for the journey she carries on. That's the parable of the cathedral and the well. And again, I don't recall now. I think she's talking about the Bible when Frederica Harris Thompson uses that parable. But I use it to talk about history. I think that's kind of the pattern we see recurring in church history. Is there something life-giving to people who need to be fed and quenched for their journeys through the deserts? But over time, it's covered up with all sorts of things built for good reasons, to show praise and thanks for the life-giving waters, but they have at times obscured the source. And so somebody comes along and rediscovers what was really life-giving about it, and something gets reformed. Reformation movements are kind of the norm, it seems to me, in church history. And I think of one of those, for example. See, that's what you do if the door's locked, come around to the side. Can somebody let him in, please? David Langstaff is coming.
Well, sir, come in.
So I think, for example, of Francis of Assisi. He's one of my poster children for this whole process. So the church grows and grows richer and more wondrous, and it's all for good reasons. Except at some point, Francis comes along and says, "You forgot why you're even here," and calls on the church to reform itself. Martin Luther King would be another, not Martin Luther King, although he might be. I was thinking Martin Luther, the original. So that's my story, the cathedral and the well. So I have some caveats about church history. The first one is to remember who writes histories. Okay, when we're talking about church histories, somebody's writing, and they're writing it for a particular purpose. And I illustrate it by this particular story. The Smiths were proud of their family tradition. They had ancestors who had come to America on the Mayflower, ancestors who included senators and Wall Street wizards. They decided to compile a family history, a legacy for their children and grandchildren. They hired a fine author. Only one problem arose: how to handle that great Uncle George who was executed in the electric chair. tarnishes the image, right? The author said he could handle the story tactfully. The book appeared and said, Great Uncle George occupied a chair of applied electronics at an important government institution. Was attached to this position by the strongest of ties, and his death came as a great shock.
Very good. Where did you find that?
Oh, I don't remember anymore. I don't remember where I found that. But that tells a tale about history, right? Who's writing the history? And are they going to tell it straight, or are they going to tell it slant?
That is good. Really good.
That's caveat number one. Now, caveat number two is when we think of history, because we're at a certain point in history, we look back and it all seems straight and inevitable. But actually, kind of to Peggy's point earlier, there's nothing straightforward about church history, nothing inevitable about the path things took. It's more like fractal geometry. It just happens. And it's not always clear that the pattern, as lovely as it might be, was as straightforward and or as inevitable as we imagine. Caveat number three, Christian history made easy. I don't have that book in my shelf. I've never read that book. I just like the title. There's nothing easy about the topic. I took 3 semesters of graduate level church history and seminary, and I was, I think, more confused by the end of each semester than I was at the start. So if it seems easy after I'm done today, I did a really bad job. Caveat number 4, this is actually one of the things, Frederica Harris Thompson, whose book I referenced early on, was actually one of my church history professors in seminary. And Frederica, among others, offer a critique of the way history is generally taught. History is generally taught by remembering great men and great ideas. And as a consequence, it misses what history is really about, which is what people are doing on the ground day in, day out. And as one illustration, of course, feminists would remind us that church history has often been told from his story's perspective, and it has omitted half of the story at least, because it omits what women were up to. So unless we're thinking about everybody, not just those great individuals, then we're not telling the whole story of church history. So with caveats in mind, I now turn your attention to the fact that I'm going to talk about great people, great ideas, great moments. And I'm using as a frame of reference this book, The Great Emergence. A book which in this case I have read and do have on my shelf. It's a lovely, thin, very readable and accessible book. It is referenced in the book the vestry is reading right now. So if that little footnote was of interest to those of you reading along, you might find more about this. This book is, oh gosh, it must be at least, I would guess 10 or 15 years old itself. And so I think it still resonates. Phyllis Tickle in this book talks about great epochs. I was going to say, what word does she use? I don't think epochs is her word, but I'm going to use that. She notes that roughly historically, every 500 years, there's a big shift. And she notes that it's true in Christianity, but she also notes that it's true in Judaism and Islam in ways that she doesn't really talk about, but at least not much, but she at least alludes to it. There seem to be these shifts that happen roughly every 500 years. And she would actually go further and say, even before the church's history, if you go back into our Judaic roots, we would find similar kinds of 500-year epochs, very broadly 500 years. And she notes it this way. She notes that roughly 500 years, in this case, we're talking about somebody who died in the year 604. Gregory the Great. And so great becomes the touch point for these different eras, these different epochs. So it's the Great Emergence, and we start with Gregory the Great, who essentially looked at the church as it was and saw it flawed. And out of that grew monasticism, which was a reform movement, which saved so much of the knowledge of the church that would otherwise have just gone away. Is that a fair, broad stroke? David's over there nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I know we think about this like that. Like, if they ever get complicated like that, Western Europe is like that.
Okay. So Western Europe, David says, like Tibet for 1,000 years. And that begins not just with him, of course, but he's the touch point we're going to have. So, and Gregory the Great. And then about 500 years later, right, the year 10,054, we have a very precise date that marks the schism between the church in the East and the church in the West. And everything we think of as Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, all of those churches are churches that continue out of that Eastern tradition. And in the West, we had what was, for a period of time, one monolithic church, what we call the Roman Catholic Church, but it was just a church in the West. And there was a patriarch in the East, and there was a pope in the West. This is simplistic, by the way, because I haven't even touched on Coptic Christianity, but never know. The Great Schism. And out of this, it's worth noting, and this is part of her point, is after each of these reformations, for the fractures that we sometimes see, as in this case in the East, between the East and the West, for the pain and the violence, if you will, done to the church by the fractures, you also have people reclaiming strength in their own various traditions. So it does fracture, but it also solidifies and identifies some core things for those different traditions. So we have East and West. And then roughly 500 years later, we can date this one very precisely, October 31st, 1517. That's the date that Martin Luther nails onto the wall, the doors of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, the 95 Theses. And that marks, as conveniently as anything, the Great Reformation. And that's gives rise then over time to the churches that we think of as all of the Western churches, not just, of course, Lutheran churches, but Lutheran and in England, the Church of England, which then gets exported, and Presbyterianism, and every modern church we have in our modern world. I mean, every church that isn't Roman Catholic that I can think of in Bend would say it was a descendant, whether they admitted it or not, of this Reformation. Now, after that, Roman Catholicism consolidates and has its own kind of a Reformation that stays internal. And all these other churches are born with their own points of emphasis and their own strengths. There it is. So on this fragmented tree, you'll see from the beginning, you have the Great Schism near the bottom, and you have Orthodoxy, in this case, going left. And then you go up and you see Lutheran and Roman Catholic and Presbyterian and all these other denominations. The Orthodox would paint it somewhat differently. They would say their church has been unchanged. Basically, we're all just people who left the true faith. And they have a point. And now we get to what's called, again, what she calls in her book, the Great Emergence, which is roughly where we are. And we don't know what's next. We do know that things are changing. Things are different. And we know enough, most of us, to say we don't know what's going to happen next. But the point of her writing the book is to say that what's coming next isn't necessarily the death of the church, though it feels like that sometimes when you're in the middle of it. What's coming next is going to be different but she would hope and argue from a broad historical perspective will be still stronger because it'll be clearer. Now, what she also touches on, and I glossed over, is that in each of these cases, the central issue has been authority. So in the case of the Great Reformation, particularly, there's a question of, is the Pope in charge of dictating to us everything that is true and right? Or Luther would say, are we better served by serving Scripture? And now the Great Emergence, this time that we're in, questions of authority are front and center. And technology has often been a part of that. Certainly part of what was going on with Reformation was printing and the ability of people to access information and to get find their own sources of authority. Well, if nothing else, the internet has done that for us in spades. So now everybody can be an expert. And it shows in ways not always helpful. We don't know what is coming next. What happened there? I lost my feed. I did want to end. I'm going to stop the share because I actually wanted to end. I'll hold up the book for Peggy. I wanted to end by saying the vestry's reading this book, The Church Cracked Open, which is kind of the most contemporary analysis of the same stuff, I think, that we've been talking about. This is written just within the last couple of years by a woman, a priest on the presiding bishop's staff these days, a former journalist. And she notes that COVID has revealed cracks that maybe we weren't so aware of. They were there, she would point out. But COVID disrupted things so much you can't ignore the cracks anymore. And then she goes and she writes around the time of the murder of George Floyd, and she talks about how racial justice in our country has further advanced the disruptions, has furthered the cracks that were already there. She doesn't have a lot of the information that we may have experienced in the last 2 years. I think she wrote this fairly early in 2020. And so we've been learning lessons since then. It is past the end of our time, and I hope Peggy might still be joining us for church. If so, if you leave soon, you'll be there in time. So thank you, Peggy, for being with us. All right. Thank you all. Next week, we pick up with a slice of history from the Church of England into the Episcopal Church, Anglicanism. I'm going to end my recording now.
Thank you.